So our last speaker of the day is Evelyn Jabri, and we will follow her with some brief comments from Gerald Lewin. Evelyn is a product strategist at Silverchair, working with STM and scholarly publishers to guide the strategic development and expansion of their information products on the Silverchair platform. Before joining Silverchair, she was Director of Editorial Development at the American Chemical Society. Evelyn began her publishing career at Nature Publishing Group, working her way up the ranks to Senior Editor at Nature Structural and Molecular Biology. Prior to becoming an editor, she was Assistant Professor of Chemistry and Biochemistry at Indiana University. She currently serves as co-chair of the Education Committee of the Society for Scholarly Publishing.
Well, thank you, Tim, and thanks everybody for hanging out for this afternoon. I promised to still get us out early today, so I have to catch a plane myself. So I also want to thank the previous speakers in this afternoon session because you set it up beautifully for me. You know, we talked about evolving subscription models. We talked about evolving journals. And obviously, if everything else around us is changing, one would expect that the metrics that we use to measure our success, our impact, our influence, are also going to have to change. And in fact, what we've seen over the past 5 years is that things are evolving. And so what I'm going to do in today's talk is talk a little bit about what we have been using for metrics to measure individual and journal success, and then also go into and give you a very quick drive-through of all the other metrics that are being considered. And lest you think I'm going to give you some main point at the end saying this is the perfect metric, let me just say right off the bat, we don't know what that is yet because everything is still evolving. So let's go ahead and get started. There we go. With one of my favorite cartoons, which is these wolves howling at the moon, and one wolf turns to the other and says, "Are we making an impact?" Well, that's a very good question. I don't know that anybody can say we are making an impact, and in fact, for some of us in this room, the word impact may mean different things, and having impact and influence can mean different things. So I'm not going to define the term, but keep in mind that you and I may have a slightly different perspective. And what matters to the different individuals that we work with, and in this case, the researchers, the universities that we work with, and even for some of us, the university administrators and the funding bodies, is slightly different. So these are just paraphrases of comments that I have heard from individuals, and for them, the publication means a tremendous amount to their reputation as well as their ability to get funding. Whereas if you look for a program officer at a funding agency, they care about results, i.e. publications from the investigators they fund, but they also care about making an impact to society. So one can imagine that the metric that you would use to measure an individual, you might actually need maybe a couple metrics, more than one, that measures different things, both for the promotion process as well as impacts to society. So just a quick question to everybody. If you were developing a metric from scratch right now, what would be some of its characteristics? Yell it out.
Is the public using the information?
That's a good one. Yep. Anything else?
Does it move the field forward?
Does it move the field forward? Very good. Yes. Anything else? All right. So those are some of the things that I'm interested in as well. So when I thought about this, I thought, well, as somebody who came up in the physical sciences, I was trained to never use just one number. So I needed more than one number, i.e. more than one metric. And in fact, what would be really great is if each of those metrics were somehow standardized or weighted so that I could really kind of compare apples and oranges. And even better would be if I could have trends, because trends of multiple metrics telling you that you're moving up in the world, that's a great thing. But if you have multiple metrics going all over the place, well, then you might want to question if you're moving up, staying stagnant, or perhaps going under, as the case may be. And it really, at the end of the day, the whole purpose of the numbers is really to try and predict, especially from an administrator, a university administrator, or a funding body, even a department head. They want to know, can we predict that this person is going to be a success, and will we get a return on our investment? So any numbers that we have, it would be great to be able to follow them along with trends and then use them for prediction purposes. And I'll be honest with you, we're not there yet. we are slowly getting at bullet number 1 with multiple different numbers, that's what I'm going to focus on today. So pre-1961, which seems like so long ago with the two previous speakers talking about 2008, but pre-1961, what really mattered and what was really used as a measure of your impact in the field was where you published. And the journal that you published in was really based on the reputation of one person, that editor. And whether or not that editor used some sort of set as a bar for what was published in that journal, and that could be a formal peer review or simply really knowing the field and being able to predict what was going to do very well. So being based on the reputation of the journal, you would expect that the reputation of the journal would go up or down depending on the reputation of one person. And so one has to be careful if you were published in a journal and the editor, unfortunately, didn't quite retain their reputation, then that might impact badly on you as an individual. Also, if there were inconsistencies in the quality of the work that was published in the journal, that brought question onto your article that you may have published in that journal. Now, in the early 1960s, the science citation came on board, and here this was great in many ways, in that we had a number rather than a qualitative judgment by a person. We now had a number to associate both with the journal, and in the case of impact factor, as well as with the article. We could look at the total citations for that article. So independent of how the journal was doing, an individual could still look at their article and say, it's doing great. Look at the number of citations I have. And here, I think this was a great step forward in that it lessened the relationship on one individual's opinion, and it really, for the first time, brought some crowdsourcing into evaluating both the journal as well as those who are publishing in it. And what we've seen over the past few years is that we've gone past just the citations. We now have different indices that rely on the citation, the H index, which can be used for an individual impact. So at this stage, we can evaluate the journal, the article, the individual who publishes in it. And for those of you, I didn't know this, but you can also use the H factor to look at the organizational impact. So we really have, the citation has been a great metric for us to use to evaluate on many different levels. And it's so popular and so well entrenched that organizations like Elsevier have actually developed products around citations. And so Elsevier's SciVal product, many of you may be familiar with this, is really designed to support individuals, funding bodies, even universities, and research institutions with analytics that they can use to, again, look at their return on investment and look at their departments and promote their departments as being really a high-impact department or an individual as a high-impact individual at that university. And so let me just show you some screenshots, and I don't expect you to read what's here. I point this out because it really is, when you go into the tool, there are many, many different little widgets and ways that you can slice and dice the data. It's very data intensive, which for a lot of university administrators and funding bodies, they really want to know. They want to slice and dice it for a particular report. So, and this particular tool allows one to do that. It can calculate H index and G index, and I think there's an I index somewhere in there. And I'm going to let you go to Wikipedia and look up all those indices. I'm not going to talk about the formulas, but nevertheless, what it's doing is really taking all of those indices based on citation and putting it in one place and allowing the user to mix and match it as they see fit. And this has been used by universities, and the University of Michigan, which is just down the street from where I live, has developed a whole research profile page. And you can see here the important things are publications, grants, and also they talk about the most frequent journals that their investigators are publishing in. And so if one looks at the recent publications, this particular tool makes it easy to export to EndNote libraries, as well as to really look specifically at the individuals at your organization or in your cluster. If it's a cancer cluster of multiple universities, one can set up a profile for that. So this not only allows you to kind of very quickly see what's happening at your organization, but it also is a way to promote your organization and be able to compare it to other organizations. And here, for example, is the most frequent journals, and one can imagine, I believe, if we click on each one of those, you can see the articles that were published and their citation information. So one can dig deep and really, at a very base scan, see what's happening with that organization. And of course, there's always just the simple view. We have so many researchers, they publish this many publications, and this is how many grants they have. So at different levels, this particular tool allows you to really aggregate in different ways the citation information. Unless you think this is just Elsevier who is developing products along this line, it's not. Microsoft Academic Research has actually gotten into the game, and in their case, they actually have a free tool that is now in beta that does pretty much the same thing. They have their own database. Elsevier bases their data on the Scopus database, whereas with Microsoft, they use multiple databases to collect the citation information, the number of publications, and I don't believe they have usage yet. But nevertheless, note that it also talks about authors, publications, organizations, and subdomains. So again, trying to target multiple layers of researchers and administrators and funding bodies. And just to kind of go through, their profile pages have a picture of the person, the number of publications, citations, the various indices. So a very quick view gives you a sense of who this person is and what's been happening in their career over time. And again, this is a free tool. You can go in and put in your own name or your favorite editor's name and see what's been happening to their productivity. And there's different ways to facet it as well. And likewise, you can do it not on an individual, but do it on an article. And this is an example of that. The tools are very similar and really very straightforward to use. And not to be outdone, Google Scholar, just in February of this year, came up with their own metrics algorithm as well. And they are doing something very similar to Microsoft in that you can take your Google profile, you can set up a profile, you can import in all the publication information, and Google makes it very easy. They will ask you, here are all the publications we think are from you. Import them all in. You can delete some, you can add some, and you can see where Google is going. They're going to start linking it to other things that you are doing to try and aggregate your professional profile. So again, lots of activity around this, fundamentally starting off with citations, a number of publications, but really some interesting trends to watch. And I will note that both Microsoft and Google Scholar and SciVal happened in the last couple of years. So really, this is now the uptick for how our metrics are going to evolve. And I put this graph here. One of the questions I had when I started looking at the data, I didn't get the same number if I put in the same person. And so I wondered what in the world is going on. They are using different databases and they're doing things slightly differently, and honestly, you gotta dig deep to understand what the slight differences are. But one of the questions I had was, well, how does this compare to the Thompson impact factor, which I'm familiar with? And so they provided this lovely little graph, or actually I think this was on a blog post, and unfortunately I did not reference it. But nevertheless, for the most part, the Google Scholar H5 index actually correlates quite well, but you can see there are outliers with certain journals. So there's slight differences in data, and something to just keep in mind is that although we would think citations would be normalized, standardized, and the way we calculate these different H factors and G factors would be standardized and normalized, there will be differences as we look through the databases. So just some little caveat to keep in mind. Now, fundamentally, I'm still not comfortable with just using citations, because for me it's still a single number. And I don't think I have to tell this group all the different limitations of this one single number. And I'm sure everyone has their own opinion. But fundamentally also the thing to keep in mind is that it's really measuring citations to international scholarly journals and really scientific journals. The humanities are sort of left out in the cold, although those are starting to come online and use this metric, as are books. You know, it's only very recently that we're starting to see citation tracking for books. So it is a limited number, and it has lots of issues, including that it really may or may not be a direct measure of the impact of the science that is published in that article. because as many of us know, and folks, scientists that I spoke to, sometimes they will cite a manuscript because it's their collaborator, or it's their colleague, or they feel it's a leader in the field, so they may not necessarily cite a manuscript from a more junior colleague. So it has again its limitations, and more importantly, if we're looking at a funding agency, this is one metric, but it doesn't measure the impact to society. So we're still missing that part of the equation when we're looking at citations. One of the other points that one of my editors once said to me is that, I think it should count. That the New York Times highlighted my article. I think this should count. And he was, very adamant about this, and I would have to agree. That's a big deal. If you're highlighted on NPR, I think that's a big deal as well. If there are news briefs written about your work, now I'm noticing that with many people's CVs, they will not only include their index, their H-index, the number of citations, they will include the usage of their article. They will include that it was highlighted in the New York Times and that it was highlighted here and there. So those things are important to the investigators. Now, whether they're important to the university administrators, we'll get to that in a minute. But anyway, there are a lot of other things that are happening with the article that constitute use. And this is what we're not yet measuring, or we're trying to measure. Now, I would like to say one thing about the journal usage factor. Jane, unfortunately, couldn't be here, but this is an initiative right now that is trying to develop basically another metric for us, but based on usage instead of citations. The advantage is that this is likely to be a more timely indicator of what's happening to the article, because usage you can immediately see, is it being used, whereas with citations there's often a lag period by the time it gets into the abstracting and indexing service and gets discovered and is cited in the manuscript. The journal usage factor also can be scale independent, so theoretically one should be able to compare it across journals of different sizes. And I'm not really going to say very much about this, except that they are continuously asking for commentary on this and whether this would be useful, and trying to determine the parameters and guidelines under which this would be used so that it makes the most sense for everyone. And furthermore, and we talked about this earlier, some of the other speakers talked about this earlier, there's a whole nother set of usage that is not even on our platforms. It is out there in Twitter land and Facebook, who knows where, okay? And that, this was, I took this quote from an article in the Chronicle, and basically, and I think it's very true, the current system of measuring scholarly influence doesn't reflect the way that many researchers, especially young investigators, work in an environment. And this is really, it is driven by the social web. So we have to consider whether this is something we want to measure as well. Twitter is one of the things, but blogs are another. So something to keep in mind. So what do we do with all this other usage? Because some of this usage is very immediate. It may actually be a better indicator of the societal influence of that research. And honestly, it's quite complicated because there are so many different outlets, and this is just really probably 10% of all the outlets that any particular group can use to promote their research. And although scientists are not necessarily using the commenting features on the articles, they are beginning to use Twitter and Facebook and and certainly Faculty of 1000. So let me just quickly go through some of these to show you how some of these organizations are looking at journal metrics, that they are actually allowing the individual to promote themselves. And I'm not going to have time, but there are now even movements to look at the usage of other types of content, so not journal articles, but databases, for example, are gaining a lot of press right now. And what does it mean to be using specific databases and pieces of data that are not part of our journal platforms or our book platforms for that matter. So we'll start with Faculty of 1000, and to me this was really kind of one of the first places that scientists were actively commenting on content, and I think everyone in this room is familiar with it, but just in case, it's primarily for the medical side of things and the biological side, but researchers could go in and say, I just read this article in Nature and it's fantastic, I give it 10 stars. and they give it some rating, and they add a commentary. It's subjective. It's not based on a metric that you can measure, but nevertheless, multiple scientists can go in and comment on the same article, and you can get a sense for, wow, everybody thinks this is a 2, or everybody thinks this is a, much better than that. So you can get that. And Faculty of 1000 has, in the last couple of years, come up with their own metric for a journal impact that is based on the comments and the rating system within the Faculty of 1000. Now, I can't honestly tell you how that compares to the journal, the impact factor, but nevertheless, there is a way to even quantify subjective comments as there are in Faculty of 1000. And more recently, there is now peerevaluations.com, and this is actually a free, very similar to Faculty of 1000 in that it provides ways to comment on articles. Plus was mentioned earlier by John, and I'd just like to kind of walk you through a little bit more about what they did with the metrics, because we saw this also with the Frontiers journals, that now in addition to having related content and figures and tables as a tab, we're starting to see a tab called metrics. And a tab, in this case, we have a comments tab as well as the metrics tab. So what exactly is under that metrics tab? And John showed some of this. Some of it is article usage, and article usage is actually right there on the top. And if you look over to your right, not only do you get the total article views, but they've also aggregated things that we're very familiar with, citations, and not only that, they've pulled it from multiple sources. And that, I think, this is really, I love this, because for me, multiple numbers, there they are, right there. And in addition, they've put it right next to what's happening on the social network. They haven't tried to combine it yet, but I'll show you an example where they do. But nevertheless, lots of numbers. What do they mean? Well, time will tell. But nevertheless, they've done a mashup of everything that's out there and put it all out there. And each of us can go there and make our own critical analysis as to whether this is impactful or not. And if we scroll down on the page, they continue this pattern of quantifying things from citations, from the social networks. They even have blogs and media coverage, and they compare that to comments that are happening on their article, on their platform. And note that right next to it, they have what the community is saying. Now, we were talking earlier about, if it's an anonymous comment, people are probably more likely to comment, but if they have to attribute it to themselves, they may or may not want to comment. Well, Twitter, you have to identify yourself, and there it is right there, the people commenting on these articles, in addition to numbers from different sources. So I think this trend, and we saw some of it earlier as well in the Frontiers Journal, I think we're going to start seeing this more and more as journals start to launch. I'll be honest with you, I've shown these pages to various society publishers and various editors, and some editors love it and some editors hate it because they don't want it to be public. Now, one thing that I've heard some clients are doing is that they will hide this and it will only be accessible to the authors, for example, or a certain group of users. So there are different ways to slice the pie, and there'll be differences of opinion as to how much you want to show. But nevertheless, I found this very satisfying as somebody who likes numbers. So, and recently PLOS partnered with Altmetric to try and provide a very quick visual for all of us who want to just get a quick read on how impactful is this article. I mean, it's one thing to scroll through all that data if you're a data person. It's another thing if you're just kind of flipping through abstracts and you want to, figure out, okay, which one should I cite? So what they've developed is this colored wheel system, and the number of colors indicate how many different outlets are using your content. And the number, obviously, is the number of outlets. So you can very quickly scan down and say, oh, look, these particular articles are being used at about the same level. Here are some comments to it. And you can then also look, for example, this, and you'll see these huge contrasts where we have an article that in PLOS Medicine that has 466 usage across multiple media, so you see the nice rainbow of colors, as opposed to another article which has has garnered less attention. So a very good visual cue, and almost an immediate indicator of the potential impact of this article. And again, just a reminder that all of these are based on social bookmarks as well as other metrics. And so if you click on that little circle, this is what you get. They again parse out, where the content is coming from, and there are different tabs, and you can look and see what they're saying on Twitter, what they're saying on Facebook, what they're saying on Google Plus, and various other places. And you can again look at demographics, much the way that the Frontiers journals had a full demographic of the usage. Altmetric actually has a little widget that you can download from their website and put in, I think most browsers. It's like a little browser widget, and it works on many of our article pages. So if you're interested to see what the little circle of color looks like for your articles, then I highly recommend doing it. It's free and it's fun. For those of you who have time to doodle around with this. But nevertheless, I found it interesting in that it immediately worked on many of the journal pages. It was actually quite satisfying for me. And they do have an API, so for those publishers who are interested in exchanging data with them, you can very easily adopt their API and actually put these metrics on your article pages up front and center instead of relying on somebody using a particular browser tool. So in doing all of this, I thought, wow, that's a tremendous amount of data. I'm not sure what it means, and I wondered if anybody cared. And so Martin Fenner recently wrote an article in Nature Materials talking about whether we should be thinking about all these different uses of the article. And he pointed out that because of strong competition and funding squeezes, it's actually going to require scientists to promote themselves. So that means that more and more scientists, theoretically, again, we'll have to see if this bears out, will be using these online tools to promote their research, because it's all about their promotions, and it's about their building their reputation, and they're no longer relying on anybody to build their reputation. They're taking control of it. And I think this is going to be truer probably for the younger generation that has come up with these social tools. They recognize what they can do with them on many levels. And if you want to get scared about how many metrics might come our way, just take a look at this table. There's everything on here, and he's proposing that scientists go out and market themselves across all of these things. And so one can imagine, well, if you can have a little widget that tells you how many tweets and Facebook likes you have, you can probably find a widget that tells you how many times you were on YouTube or Vimeo or the like. So, but anyway, and one of the tools I did want to show you, because with scientists taking control of their own reputation, and we saw with the SciVal and with the Microsoft product that the universities are taking control of their reputation. You can just imagine like different levels of profiles that one can see. They're the profiles that Microsoft makes for you. But this is a tool called ReaderMeter, and one can go in and, like the Google, it very much is a competitor to the Google. One can develop your own little page of your top 10 publications, the total number of bookmarks, the number of the most read publications, who your co-authors are, and this is actually, again, relatively easy. You can go and look up ReaderMeter, and you can plug in your favorite editor and make this page for them. So there's a lot of opportunity for this promotion, and what I take away from this is there also seems to be a desire to have many different metrics from different levels, from the investigators, from the universities, from the funding bodies. So the good thing about all of this is that you have a lot of metrics. Potentially you could see very quickly that something is impactful. For the most part, especially with many of the free tools, you know where the data is coming from and how it's calculated. So there's a little bit more transparency than you might have with some of the citation tools that we currently use. And really, these all, from my perspective, complement the citation metric that we have. They're never going to displace it and shouldn't displace it, in my opinion. The possibly ugly. And the possibly ugly is everything that we see with commenting, that it's one group that can totally skew the data. One can imagine a really extremely productive marketing department really hitting Twitter very hard and giving a particular article a tremendous amount of buzz, for example. Totally legit. One can also generate a huge controversy and have a tremendous amount of usage of an article, not because it's impactful, because it's caused a huge stir in the community. So one has to be careful about how we're going to work with these types of metrics. They can all be gained. It's, that's just a given. They can all come from unreliable sources. In this case, because many of these are web-based, again, you may lose access to that URL. You may no longer have access to the data, and that may screw your data as well. And for me, the biggest challenge when I looked at these mashups of data is that I couldn't compare. I thought I was comparing apples and oranges. And that's going to be the challenge for us. It's nice to have lots of numbers, but how do we go about comparing them? And I was reminded by a quote by a very impactful scientist, Albert Einstein, where he said, everything that can be counted does not necessarily count. And that's very true. And everything that counts cannot necessarily be counted. And that's something I think that we should definitely take away from these metrics as we evolve, and really think hard about what is it we should be counting and what we should really not be counting ever. So I just want to go back here and just talk about sort of my ideas of the ideal measures of influence and where we are right now as publishers. It'd be great to have it based on a panel of metrics. I feel we're there. We have panels of metrics. We're not quite at the point where we can account for the strengths and weaknesses of each of it. And I think that the next couple of years, we're going to start working that out. We're going to start understanding, how to compare the tweets to everything else. And also what I'm not seeing, we saw with the Altmetric example, a combining of all these metrics. But really, what we need to be able to do is have multiple metrics that can be combined in different ways by different people. So a funding agency could care less possibly about what's happening on Twitter. Okay, they may not care at all. Whereas the university may only care if it's really promoting them, So you can imagine different ways of slicing and dicing this data. And so when we're thinking about standardizing these data, we should also be thinking about how can we mix and match them, and so that they actually are a useful tool to the many clients that we work with. Normalization and standardization is always a biggie, and I'm not sure how we are going to figure out how many reads equate a citation, or how many tweets equal a bookmark, or should bookmarks even be counted? That I'm not sure. So something I think that those of us in the room who have grown up with the citations and really worked through a lot of standards on many different levels, I think we have a lot to contribute to this discussion, and I do think we should get involved here, because if we have Microsoft and Google involved, we need to be involved in making sure these metrics are what will serve us and our customers in the best possible way. I'm all for experimentation. Recently somebody told me, well, what would really be great is to figure out, the context of the usage. Did they click on this or this part? And that's lovely, but that's a level of metrics that I can't even imagine, honestly. I'm happy to just have, what happens at the article level. That would be good for me for now. And I think there's lots of opportunities for all of us in the room to think about products or services that can aid our customers with this. Because fundamentally, we have been and we continue to be assisting, especially for those of us who are working with society publishers or who are society publishers. We are about assisting that society with its reputation. We happen to work with them on many different levels beyond publication sometimes. And these metrics may help us actually assist them with enhancing their reputation and really determining their return on investment. And if we can help them with those, I think they will see us as a much more valuable asset to their programs. So with that, I want to just thank Tim and Alan Press for inviting me, and thank you all for staying to hear my talk. And I'm happy to answer questions. I think the mic's coming your way.
Thank you. That was a ton of information.
The slides will be available, so.
I do think that we need to be careful about including in our metrics what mainstream media does. Because a carefully crafted press release on a sensational topic will get covered by the New York Times, and it doesn't mean that that article has one iota of usefulness to the scientific community. And when newspapers are downsizing their staffs, the first ones to go are the ones that do fashion and science and the things that aren't considered front page news, which leaves the science stuff to be covered by people that don't have a clue about how to write about science. So I think that if we say, oh, it's great for an author and it's great for a journal when the New York Times has their name, particularly on the front page, but I've seen time and time again when the editor of the journal says, this article's crap and it doesn't mean anything.
That's right, yeah, and I've heard that, and the editor who was like, I do not want this anywhere on my journal site ever, was actually used this very similar example that they really, they had multiple issues, but one of them was, there's a lot of sensationalism out there. In the case of the Facebook and Twitter, lots of concern about people just kind of going in there and tweeting and retweeting something because it was a retraction. Well, he didn't want that highlighted. That's the last thing you want highlighted if you're a journal editor. And also, the other concern was very interesting as well in that, a journal, no matter how good it is, still has a variety of content, some of which gets used a lot, some of which immediately, and some of which may not get used for 6 months or 10 months or maybe even 10 years later. And so there was a concern that by providing these metrics in a very public way, that it might actually do a disservice to some scientists because their article may not have garnered a tweet or a Facebook like. So there are lots of concerns, and I completely agree. I think we have to be very careful with it. I like that we're trying lots of different things, and it'll be interesting to see how much uptake we get and how much usage we get from the metrics.